The great state of Pennsylvania is home to a civics geek's dream come true. The state of Pennsylvania has a voter hall of fame. Every year, into this hall of fame, they induct new super voters, Pennsylvanians who have voted in 50 consecutive elections. Quote, the Voter Hall of Fame inductees hold a special place in Pennsylvania history. For 50 years, they have placed their responsibilities as citizens of this Commonwealth first. We are grateful for their lifelong commitment to democracy, and we proudly induct them into the Pennsylvania Voter Hall of Fame. In Pennsylvania, they like to say that they take voting seriously. They take their civic responsibility as participants in a democracy seriously. Here's this year's Voter Hall of Fame ceremony in Lycoming County, where 100 new super voters were inducted into the Hall of Fame. Here's the ceremony from Wayne County, 19 new Hall of Famers inducted. Here's the Elk County induction ceremony from last year. 200 new Hall of Fame super voters inducted in Elk County last year. Awesome. The Pennsylvania Voter Hall of Fame has been around since 1982. Right now, there are almost 6,000 registered voters who are Hall of Fame super voters, whose vote in this year's election would represent more than their 50th consecutive ballot cast. But if the Pennsylvania Hall of Fame super voters thought they were just going to be able to waltz right into their precinct and cast a ballot like they have for the last 50 years, well, this year they would be wrong. That's because back in March, Pennsylvania's Republican-led legislature passed, and its Republican governor, Tom Corbett, signed a strict new voter ID law that requires voters to present up-to-date government-issued photo ID they never had to show in order to vote before they are allowed to vote this year. It's documentation that a substantial number of Pennsylvania voters do not have. Last month, the state released data showing that more than 750,000 Pennsylvania voters, almost 10% of the state's registered voters, do not have photo ID from the state. They are legal voters. They just don't have this thing that they say you now have to show that you never had to show before if you want to vote. And it turns out there are a lot of Hall of Fame Pennsylvania super voters who are among them. According to an analysis by the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO, nearly a quarter of these Pennsylvania super voters who are in the Hall of Fame, who have cast ballots in the past 50 elections in a row, they do not have valid state-issued ID and could therefore be prevented from voting in November. One of these super voters, a 91-year-old whose expired driver's license is not considered a valid form of ID because it's expired, told Talking Points memo, quote, I wouldn't be able to vote if I don't get some form of ID. I wondered why it was. What was the problem that they'd pass something like that? It's awful funny. A 90-year-old who gave up her driver's license 3 months ago told TPM, quote, I don't know why, for what reason voter ID was passed. I couldn't tell you. Zachary Roth, who is a senior writer and editor at MSNBC.com, went to Pennsylvania and talked to a 101-year-old Pennsylvanian who does not have the proper photo ID to vote in November.
How would you feel if you weren't able to vote?
I'd feel very badly because I know we've come a long ways when we could not vote. See, I remember when the black folks did not vote.
This is a state that takes the civic duty of voting so seriously that it has a voting hall of fame. But this year, the state of Pennsylvania is poised to deliberately disenfranchise many of its most dedicated voters. You voted in every election for 50 years straight? Congratulations. Here's a glossy certificate and a special place in our Civics Hall of Fame forever. Now, no more voting for you. So that's Pennsylvania. In the great state of Iowa, while Republicans tried for it, there is no new Iowa voter ID law for this year's election, but that doesn't mean that nobody gets disenfranchised. The Republican Secretary of State in Iowa has now suddenly moved to start a purge of the Iowa voter rolls. The Iowa Secretary of State used an emergency procedure that allowed him to issue the new purge rules without giving notice to or taking input from the public. He tells the Des Moines Register that the usual notice and public participation are contrary to the public interest because these procedures, this voter purge, had to be in effect before the November 6th presidential election. So he's trying really quick, like with no public oversight, to purge the voter rolls 3 months before a presidential election. What could possibly go wrong? That's Iowa. And as long as we're talking shady new Republican election rules in swing states just in time for Election Day, we also need to make a quick stop in Ohio. For the past couple of nights on this show, we've been talking about a new partisan disaster in voting rights in Ohio. Now, the big news, Beltway attention controversy in Ohio right now is the Republicans moving to cut off the last 3 days of early voting. Expansive early voting, of course, is the change that's credited with turning the hours-long nightmare lines of the '04 election in Ohio into something resembling a functioning election day in 2008. But that relatively trouble-free election in 2008 resulted in Barack Obama winning the state. So coincidentally, this year, Republicans in Ohio would like to have fewer early voting days. Ohio's Republican Secretary of State John Husted has been trying to defend that move, trying to explain why, if the point is not to get fewer people to the polls, not to have longer lines on Election Day, why it would be so important to cut off early voting 3 days early.
I don't think the bar is too high there for anybody who really cares about the future of our country and wants to have their voice heard by voting. We try to make it easy, but we can't. I say we're not 7-Eleven. We can't stay open 24/7 and let anybody vote by any rule that they want to. We have standards.
That is Ohio's Republican Secretary of State's explanation for cutting off the last 3 days of early voting in the state, including the Sunday before Election Day, which is when African-American churches typically mobilize their congregations to go early vote en masse. You can't just go around voting whenever you want. We have standards. The fact that those standards are likely to result in longer lines in the big cities where Democrats are favored, I'm guessing the Secretary of State would say that is just a coincidence, but I would love the chance to ask him. Even as questions remain about the cutoff of those last 3 days of early voting in Ohio, so far the Secretary of State John Husted has not answered questions about the other election scandal in Ohio for this year, the one I find hard to believe is not front page news all over the country. The bigger election scandal in Ohio right now is that on a county-by-county basis, elections boards are deciding whether to allow early voting on nights and weekends. Each county's election board in Ohio's 88 counties is evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, equal numbers. In counties that tend to vote for the Republican candidate, like Warren and Butler counties, where John McCain won in '08 by big margins, in those counties, Republicans and Democrats on the elections boards are voting together to allow early voting on nights and weekends. So that means more voting in Republican counties. But in the counties that tend to go Democratic, like Cuyahoga and Franklin and Summit, where Barack Obama won by huge margins in 2008, the Republicans on those county election boards are voting against early voting on nights and weekends. And guess who gets the break for the tie votes in those counties? Guess who gets to break those ties? This guy, Republican Secretary of State John Husted, who is voting with the Republicans, naturally, to deny early voting on nights and weekends in Democratic counties. He is personally intervening to make sure there are fewer early voting hours on nights and weekends in Democratic counties, while there are more early voting hours on nights and weekends in Republican counties.